We should probably get going here, as much fun as it is to stand around talking. Oh, thank you, John.
Did you want one?
No, I've got it all in my notes.
Okay. Just follow one or two. There'll be plenty.
There's plenty for everybody. I wasn't sure how many to print, so I printed too many.
All right.
They tell me to print, Pastor Ray told me to print 20 when I do the bulletin.
20?
So,
Okay, I think I printed 15.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's
So.
probably more than enough for Sunday school, because not everyone comes to that.
Yeah. So. All right. So happy Mother's Day to the two mothers that are in here. Yeah. Well, I guess there's three. Linda's in here too. So happy Mother's Day. So you guys, I was thinking about what to talk about this morning, and I decided that for Sunday school we're gonna just do a normal sermon. Some of you guys may it's actually a continuation of a sermon that I did last year, with lots of review, because I don't know yeah. So and then it'll be a little bit more Mother's Day themed for the main service. So, but our world is full of stories, true and fiction, of underdogs, which are who has a good definition of an underdog? Somebody have a good definition?
I was
Yeah.
gonna say Bumblebee.
I don't know, I don't think you guys get done.
Yeah, so we have lots of stories. We have Cinderella, and we have David and Goliath, the Count of Monte Cristo. If you haven't read that book or watched the movie, it's great. Les Miserables, or however you pronounce it. If you haven't read the book or watched the movie, do it. It's good, other than one small scene. But anyway. And even our movies are full of underdogs. You have Cool Runnings and Rocky, which I haven't even seen Rocky, but Google said it was an underdog. I think I have. I don't know. Maybe I've seen Rocky. I've seen one of the Rocky movies, I guess. Holes. Have any of you ever watched or read Holes? It's an underdog book and movie, and it's weird, but it's also an example of an underdog. So anyway, and in the Bible we have an underdog story in the story of Joseph. So some of you may remember, I don't know how many of you guys were here. Some of you guys may remember that last year I preached a sermon on the beginning, the first few chapters of the life of Joseph, and some of the background to his family life and such. And I kept wanting to come back to it and just never actually got around to it. So I decided to do that for Sunday school this morning. So we're going to spend the first pretty good chunk of time reviewing his family background, and then we're going to look at the first part of his life in Egypt as well. So before we go any further, let's pray. Father, thank you for the opportunity that we have to come and worship you and learn about you, and thank you for the story of Joseph and for the work that we see you doing in his life and even in the midst of the hardship of his life. Pray that you would open our eyes to the text this morning and help us to learn and grow in you. In Jesus' name, amen. So, Joseph's family, if you want to look at the text, it's, let's see. It kind of comes from chapter, oh boy. 36 is when Joseph starts, but I'm going back a little bit further. Joseph's family, as you probably know, was a giant dysfunctional mess. Which is actually the first blank you guys have. So Joseph's dad was Jacob. Jacob deceived his brother Esau for his birthright, and his father Isaac to steal Esau's blessing. Then Jacob fled to Haran because he was afraid that Esau was going to kill him. Found his uncle Laban, fell in love with his cousin Rachel. Laban gave permission to Jacob to marry her on the condition that Jacob would work for him for 7 years. And then the morning after the wedding, I still don't know how this happened because I don't know how you married the wrong girl without realizing it. But he wakes up the next morning to find that he's sleeping next to Rachel's sister Leah, not Rachel. So Laban says, sure, you can marry Rachel too, but you have to work for me. You can marry her next week, and you have to work for me for 7 more years. And so now Jacob was married to 2 women, but he only ever really loved Rachel. And the fact that the 2 sisters were married to the same guy created a perfect environment for a large amount of jealousy and scheming. Genesis 29:30. If you want the details, you can look at Genesis 29:30 through chapter 30, verse 24. I just want to skim over the top for the sake of review and background. And that section mostly deals with Rachel and Leah vying and fighting and scheming for trying to get their husband's love and attention. Leah, being the unloved wife, tried to earn her husband's affection and love by giving him sons, and more sons. And then at the beginning of chapter 30, Rachel, who has not been able to have any kids, starts to get desperate because she's just not getting pregnant and not having kids and not giving Jacob heirs. So even though she still enjoys the position of favorite wife and continued to enjoy the position of favorite wife until the day she died. So the drama continues with both wives giving their personal maidservants to Jacob to have children on their behalf because they weren't getting pregnant. And it also included Leah buying time with her husband from Rachel with some mandrakes that Reuben, her son, found. And it just goes on, the mess and the dysfunctionalness of this family. And by the end, when all the dust is settled, Jacob has 12 sons and 1 daughter, or at least 1 daughter that's recorded. And Rachel has only 2 of the children, Joseph and Benjamin, and she died giving birth to Benjamin. So that's a little bit of the background to the story of Joseph and what we find at the beginning of chapter 37, which is where the story of Joseph starts. And if you were here for my last sermon, you may remember that we covered the dreams of Joseph and up to when his brothers sold him into slavery. So again, we're going to kind of zoom over the top of chapter 37. But this is the point when Joseph, who is the firstborn son of Jacob's favorite wife, enters the scene. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, and he showed it at the beginning of chapter 37 by giving him the coat of many colors. Joseph's brothers, on the other hand, couldn't stand him. He was a tattletale. Let's see if I can find it. It's in there somewhere. Oh yeah, where's the verse number? Verse 2. Joseph was 17 years old, and he brought a bad report of his brothers to his father. So me being an older brother, I kind of understand the brother's sentiment. Like, yeah, that little dirty rotten guy went and told him, Daddy, that I wasn't taking good care of the sheep. So he was a tattletale. He was father's favorite. And verse 4 says that they hated him and they could not speak peaceably to him. And that's when the dreams start. Joseph's first dream was about a bunch of sheaves of grain bowing down to his sheaf. He had 12 sheaves of grain, and they came up to, there were 12 sheaves of grain total, and 11 of the sheaves came up to his sheaf and bowed down to him. And he made the brilliant decision of telling his brothers about it. Why, I don't know. And then right after that, a little while later, he has another dream. And it's there's 12 stars in the sun and the moon. And 11 of the stars and the sun and the moon all come and bow down to his star. And again, he has the brilliant idea of telling his brothers about this, and his father. And both dreams blatantly predicted that Joseph would rule over his family, even though he wasn't the oldest. And like I said, I don't know what possessed Joseph to tell his brothers, and it still baffles me.
Otherwise, he wouldn't have been sold and he wouldn't say, I mean,
Yes.
if you look at the whole progression.
Yes. So it was all part of God's will. It was serving God's plan. But the lack of thinking of a 17-year-old still amazes me. So the dream served two purposes. The first one was to predict the future. And the second one, as Linda just pointed out, was to serve as a catalyst for their fulfillment. And you guys know the story. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers. And when the brothers saw him coming, they said, "Oh, let's kill him." And Reuben convinced them to throw Joseph into a nearby pit instead. The pit had no water in it. God was already looking out for him. So Joseph didn't drown in the pit. And God had not abandoned Joseph. The brothers were just going to leave him in there to die. But, and they sat down for a nice meal. Because, nothing works up an appetite like throwing your brother into a pit. And they look up from their meal and they see a group of merchants coming. And Reuben wasn't there. He was off taking care of the sheep somewhere. And all the other brothers saw a business opportunity. Why let a perfectly good potential slave die in the pit when you could just sell him into slavery? So, and just like that, Joseph was off to Egypt. And it all seemed very dark for Joseph. But in fact, God was setting in motion a very complex rescue plan for a crisis that was coming that nobody even knew about yet. And so God was, in a sense, sacrificing Joseph, separating him from his family, and sending him away to 30 years of college in the school of really hard knocks. And Joseph's life in Egypt is made up of three main sections, at least the beginning part of his life in Egypt. And you can divide it up roughly along the lines of the chapters. It's not perfect. So the sections are roughly chapters 39 through 41. In case you're wondering, we're only covering one of those sections today. So what we're going to be covering today is chapter 39, 1 through 20, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So Joseph started out, he was sold as a slave to the house of Potiphar. And we don't really know much about Potiphar. Potiphar, however you want to pronounce it. Tomato. The original text is somewhat unclear. If you go back to the original Greek, we know he was an officer of Pharaoh in Pharaoh's court. The New King James translates it as captain of the guard. That word can also be translated as chief butcher, which could also mean he was the chief executioner. So we don't really know. He was somebody important in Pharaoh's court. That's what we know for sure. But one of the first things that comes up is in verse 2 that kind of bookends the section, or starts the section, is in verse 2 of chapter 39. It says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man." God was faithful to Joseph, even in this traumatic time of being ripped from his family and taken to a foreign land. God was at work behind the scenes on Joseph's behalf. Joseph rose quickly through the ranks of servants in the house of Potiphar. Verse 4 says, Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Joseph was eventually put in charge of everything that Potiphar owned. He started out as Potiphar's personal assistant, as his personal servant, and eventually Potiphar reached the point where he trusted him so deeply that he didn't worry about a thing around the house. All he worried about was sticking the fork of food in his mouth, and then presumably his role in Pharaoh's court. But as far as things at home, Joseph was in charge of everything. And God blessed the house of Potiphar because of Joseph. But Potiphar's wife had wandering eyes. And Joseph was a pretty good-looking guy. If you continue reading at the end of verse 6, it says, of chapter 39, it says, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." The only other person in the Bible who's described in those words is Joseph's mother, Rachel. Now, when you read about Rachel, it says she was beautiful. That the Hebrew word that's translated there, presumably, it just means he was good looking, basically. He was beautiful, he was handsome. So evidently, Rachel passed on her good looks to her son, and Potiphar's wife took notice. So then we keep reading in verse 7, it says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not..." I lost my place. "My master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Joseph was fiercely loyal to both Potiphar, and he refused it because he knew it was wrong. He didn't want to sin before Potiphar, and he didn't want to sin before God. And in fact, he refused to even be in her presence. It says in verse 10, so it was that she spoke to Joseph day by day, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her, nor lie with her, to lie with her, or to be with her. Joseph refused to give in to her wiles. And so one day Potiphar's wife decides to take it to the next level. And she caught Joseph in the house and tried to physically force him to lie with her. It says in verse 11, starting in verse 11, it says, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled, and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house, saying to them, see, he has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she catches Joseph in the house by himself, tries to force him to do what she wants, and Joseph still refused to give in, even to this temptation, and he fled, leaving his garment behind in the hands of Potiphar's wife. And evidently, Potiphar's wife had had enough hearing the word no, and decided it was time for some revenge, because she starts yelling and screaming and just generally making a big ruckus, to use the technical term. And she goes on to claim that Joseph had tried to rape her, which was basically the opposite of what was true. And she told the same story to Potiphar when he gets home. If you read on in verse 16, it says, so she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. And then Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. I can't explain why Potiphar just threw him in prison.
He probably knew that he didn't do it, but he had to do something to save face.
That is the generally accepted position, and I would tend to.
He would have been executed right away.
I would tend to think that way too. I don't think Potiphar didn't have that power, considering his station in the king's court. I'm pretty sure he could have had Joseph killed if he wanted. The other option that I see from the text is it does say that Potiphar was angry. So I don't know if it was anger at Joseph or if he was just angry at the whole situation. So that I don't. Most of the people that I've read, the commentators that I've read, will say exactly what you said, John. That Potiphar knew his wife, and he knew Joseph. Well, I mean, Joseph was his personal, basically, manservant for however long. It wasn't like Joseph was a stranger to the house. So I suspect Potiphar saw through it, and
Right. After he investigated it enough, he probably figured it out, time to sort everything out, so.
right. So Joseph, for the second time in his life, is sent away unjustly and against his will when Potiphar throws him in prison. Probably, I suspect, to save face for his house. I suspect it was probably an honor issue of this situation was bringing shame on his house and he needed to deal with it. So this section ends with Joseph in prison. And next week I'm planning to go on to verse 21. And you'll probably see where the bookends are, or where start seeing the pattern if you read verse 21. But I want to pause now and look at what we can learn from the life of Joseph from this little section in verse, well, I guess it's not a little section, but from chapter 39. So the first one is, and I think this is probably the number one conclusion from chapter 39, and you've probably all heard it preached, is Joseph didn't just walk away from the temptation. He ran. He fled. Temptation is hard to resist. By definition, if something's tempting you, it's not because you don't like it. If chocolate tempts you, not that chocolate is sin, but chocolate is tempting not because you don't like it, but because you do like it, right? Ice cream is tempting because it tastes good. Wally's cooking is tempting because it tastes good. Okay, so if something is a temptation to sin, no, Wally, your food is not a sin.
Overindulgences.
Yes. So if the temptation to sin, by definition, temptation is hard to resist. So it's important that we don't just, walk slowly away from it. We need to run. Don't play with it. Don't think about it. Just get out of there. But the second thing that I want you to notice is that God was at work in the background of Joseph's life here. Remember at the beginning it said God was with Joseph and he blessed everything that he did. Joseph's family background was messed up. And his stint at Potiphar's house, I don't think he was planning on going to prison for being falsely accused. That wasn't part of the plan. But even through the mess, even through the suffering, God was at work in the background. His brothers had sold him into slavery unjustly after tossing him into a pit, which I can't think felt good. I don't think they gently lowered him into the pit. Potiphar threw him in prison even though he had tried to do the right thing. But God was with Joseph at Potiphar's house. He had been directing the events of Joseph's life from the beginning, starting with the dreams that he sent to Joseph. That started the whole, eventually, you guys know the story, those dreams eventually led to the dream's fulfillment. And God was directing the events according to his plan in Joseph's life to achieve God's bigger plan and purpose. And ultimately, God was preparing Joseph for his future role. And we'll see this kind of brought to a head next week when we hopefully go through the next two sections. I don't know, 2 chapters might be a little bit ambitious for 45 minutes, but we'll see this brought to a head next week, either way, when we see God's plan reach its fulfillment in Joseph's life. And now in your notes, I want you to cross out the Joseph and write, God is preparing me for his future role. Because he's still doing this in our lives too. He's at work in spite of the mess, or through the mess, through the suffering, in times of suffering. He's preparing all of us for what he has for our future roles. If you're still alive, God still has a purpose for you in life. And he is always working behind the scenes, growing us to become more like Christ, and shaping you so that you can do and continue to do his work. When I look back over my life, I can see God's hand preparing me for the role that I'm in now, and I'm sure he's continuing to do that for things that he has for my future. And I can confidently say that it's the same for each of you. And sometimes God uses suffering to shape us and grow us into his image. But he's got a plan. So, anyway, that's what I have for Joseph for this morning.
So God's works in the background, but he's also working in the foreground.
Yep. And I meant to put it in the notes, and it might actually be in for the morning service. But God is working whether you feel like it or not. He's working.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's all I have. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.